A few days ago, I did a video on my favorite narrative history books, in which I talked about the fact that I've never really been a serious academic person, but I love history as narrative, and so love history books that tell a good narrative. But of course, right alongside narrative history is the other half of the equation, which is historical fiction. And in fact, even more so than narrative history, historical fiction is what really got me into history at a young age. Now, as you know, there are all types of historical fiction out there. And there are some historical fiction that's just set in a historical time period but doesn't really involve any historical figures. I'm a big fan of that as well, and have talked about several of those types of books on this channel over the years. But when I think of historical fiction, the first thing that comes to mind to me is the historical fiction I fell in love with when I was younger, which is historical fiction which is essentially just history dramatized. So all the characters are real historical people. Most of the events are historical, and if there's something in the book which is not historical, at the very least it doesn't contradict history. It's just filling in a gap where history is silent. And it's essentially just almost writing a straight history, but you're making it into a drama. So you're adding in the dialogues, you're adding what the characters were thinking, you're adding in those little touches about what the room looked like or how the weather felt, or all those immersive details which makes you feel like you're there, feel like you're in the room with them. But you're also learning a lot of straight history with it. Straight here in the sense meaning like direct. That is the type of historical fiction that I first got into when I was in high school. And I was interested in ancient Roman history, and I think there is a lot of this type of historical fiction tends to be about the ancient world, I think. Probably, I suspect, for the reason that we know enough about it that there's a story, but we are not overwhelmed with information that would make it impossible to give the author any sort of flexibility. So, if you're writing about George Washington or something, the amount of information you'd have about him from people's diaries and letters and correspondence and historical records and stuff like that would leave an author very little room to create their own fictional version of Washington without contradicting something somewhere. I think that's why this tends to be more prevalent with the ancient history, although I don't know, maybe I'm just not aware of more recent historical fiction just because I tend to like ancient history. Although that being said, some of the books on this list will be about more recent history. So anyways, the criteria for books on this list is that, I guess the gold standard is all historical characters, no fictional characters, and none of the events in the book contradict historical, documented historical fact. Now, with some of the books on this list, we're going to bend these rules a little bit, but that's the standard I'm establishing here. And if you, like me, love this kind of historical fiction, by all means, if you're on BookTube, I encourage you to make your own video on this. I know several people already have. To a certain extent, I'm a little bit late to the party, but if you haven't yet, consider this an invitation. Also, if you're not on YouTube but active in the comments, please feel free to leave your recommendations in the comments down below. I do, of course, read all of them and take up a number of those recommendations. Okay, so all of those preliminaries out of the way. These are the ones that have made the biggest impact on me. And I'm going to try and do this roughly chronologically in terms of when I encountered these books in my life. And the earliest historical fiction I remember encountering, I'm sure I must have read historical fiction before this, but the earliest ones I remember is the Paul Meyer books, Pontius Pilate and the Flames of Rome. Now, Pontius Pilate I reread recently and reviewed it on this channel. And as with the previous video, all of the books that I've already reviewed on this channel, I will link to in the description down below. And then if I haven't talked about it yet on this channel, obviously I won't link to it. So, right. I encountered these books when I was in 9th grade, and Pontius Pilate I've recently come back and reread. The Flames of Rome I have not reread. I am due for a reread, and I hope to get around to that hopefully within the next year, and I'll talk about that when I reread it. But these are, I guess, what I would call Christian historical fiction. So, Paul Maier is a religious author. He's also a scholar of the ancient world, but he's a religious author. And he writes books about the Roman Empire that incorporate the New Testament and treat the New Testament as historical fact. So if you're a skeptic, you may find yourself outside of the target audience for these books, but I would recommend them anyways for this reason. I think that it's not the job of historical fiction to critically examine the sources. Historical fiction is to simply take the sources and say, okay, let's make a story here. And if you're a skeptic, you're no doubt aware that there's a large body of Christian literature, and you can maintain your skepticism and still dip into it and read it. Right. Pontius Pilate takes what little we know from secular sources about the life of Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, when Jesus was crucified, and integrates that with the stories from the Bible to create a historical narrative. The Flames of Rome take some of the stories about the early church from Acts, and then also integrates that with what was happening with the Roman Empire at the time and the Roman emperors, Claudius and Nero, and the persecution of the early church, and again integrates all of that to create a narrative. In the introduction to each of those books, Paul Maier makes a big deal of saying that he has only used historical characters in these books. Any character that has a name is attested to in the historical record. And if the character is not attested to in the historical record, then they are not named. And then also nothing in the book contradicts the historical record. And again, because this was maybe one of the first historical fiction I was exposed to, at least that I remember, those rules have kind of stuck with me as the gold standard for historical fiction. Now, coming back and having reread Pontius Pilate recently, I realize even within those rules what huge flexibility he is giving himself, because the characters in his book, often he takes a character that's just mentioned once. I'm busy now. Yeah, Daddy's busy. He takes a character that's just mentioned once briefly in the New Testament, and this character will have like a whole story arc. Pontius Pilate himself is a character that has huge gaps in his story, where the fictional part of it will come in. Flames of Rome, even though I haven't read that book for 30 years, it's based on a minor Roman character, Sabinus, who's the brother of the future Emperor Vespasian. Vespasian is a major historical character, but his brother is maybe more of a minor character. So he does build in a lot of fiction around these minor characters where we don't know a lot of the details. But again, that's part of the fun or freedom of historical fiction. So there you go. The next historical fiction book I remember reading, which I also got from my school library, was Julian by Gore Vidal. And as coincidence would have it, we're moving from Christian historical fiction right to anti-Christian historical fiction. That's just how I happen to encounter these books. So Julian is, if you don't know, he is the Roman emperor who is notorious for trying to reverse the Christianization of the Roman Empire. So Constantine had converted the Roman emperor. Constantine had created the Roman Empire into Christianity. Julian, who came a few emperors later after Constantine, tried to reverse the whole thing. And he did not succeed fighting against the tides of history, but that's what he was trying to do. And Gore Vidal writes up his story as a historical fiction, gives him a very sympathetic writing. One senses that Gore Vidal was sympathetic to his ideological cause of trying to reverse Christianity, even though it didn't work. This again is a book that I'm due for a reread because I have not read it since high school. But I do feel like, well, as with a lot of historical fiction, I do feel like one of the reasons I like historical fiction is I feel it's much more memorable to me than just kind of reading a straight history and a normal history. And so I do feel like I remember a lot of the scenes in that book even now, and remember it as being quite well written and a very interesting story. And Julian had a very interesting story. He's even before he became the emperor, he had to deal with all the murderous backstabbing that happens when you're part of the imperial family in ancient Rome. And there's quite an interesting story there. The next historical fiction I've encountered in high school was I, Claudius by Robert Graves, which is the story of the Julio-Claudian family of emperors through the eyes of Claudius, who was a very unlikely person to succeed to the Roman emperor. But when everyone ahead of him ended up dying or being killed off, then he was kind of the only person left standing to succeed. So nobody thought he would ever amount to anything, and then, spoiler alert, by the end of the book, he becomes the Roman emperor. Yet another book in which I'm way overdue for a reread and hope to reread it again sometime soon. A few years ago, when I was out in Vietnam, I read the sequel to it, which I couldn't get when I was in high school because my library didn't have it, but Claudius the God, which is a historical fiction which continues the story of Claudius as he is the Roman emperor. Then, the other big series, the other big historical fiction is a whole series which I encountered in high school, which is Masters of Rome by Colleen McCullough. And this is a series which certainly has its faults. We can talk a lot about its faults if you want to. But it is also just wonderfully epic in its sweep. So it starts all the way back with the generation before Julius Caesar, Sulla and Marius, and their rivalry and simultaneous rise to power, and then the little civil war that played out between them. And then the aftermath of that, and then it goes through the rise of the next generation, all the way to the end of the Roman Republic. These are massive books. I think they're all over 700 pages. Some of them are clocking in at about 1,000. And there's, I don't remember, 7 or 8 of them in this series. But what a journey this is. I read most of them in high school, although by the time I graduated high school, they weren't all out yet. So I came back in 2006 to read a couple more of them. And I still have to come back and read the last one. But now that I'm back in the U.S., when I was in Vietnam, I could never find these books anywhere. But now that I'm back in the U.S., I want to go and start at the beginning and just reread the whole series. What a great reading experience that would be. And hopefully, again, I'll get around to that reading project one of these days. But yeah, especially the first few books. I mean, by the time we get into Caesar and Pompey and Cicero, we're getting into very well-traveled territory, which most people know about. But the first few books, first couple books especially, deal with the generation before that, which is not as widely known. And it was definitely my first experience with a lot of those characters. I knew who Sulla was from my high school history class. Sulla was the first person to establish himself as dictator of Rome. I mean, extra legally. First person to conquer Rome, so to speak. But I did not know a lot of the other characters. And once again, I feel like even though it's been 30 some years, more than 30 years at this point, since I read those books, I remember it so well because those scenes just made such an impression on me. So to this day, when I go back and look at some sort of history book talking about this period, I immediately remember who these characters are and can remember the scenes from the book. And yeah, that's one of the reasons I love historical fiction so much. Is it just seems much more real to me than normal history. Even though, of course, they're taking some. Even though, of course, it's not purely historical. But yeah, you know what I mean. I'm not going to belabor that point. On to the next one. There's a Cicero trilogy by Robert Harris, which has 3 books about the life of Cicero: Imperium, Conspirata, and Dictator. I think the titles are slightly different depending on whether you get them in the US or England, but a trilogy of books. I enjoyed these books in the sense that they were well written and easy to read. I was resistant to the first one because I thought it was... having come off of Colleen McCullough's books, which cover a lot of the same period, I was... thought that Robert Harris's view of a lot of these characters was a lot blander. It was like Cicero's a good guy, everybody else is all over here as a bunch of scoundrels, and I felt like the complexity of the time period was getting flattened out a little bit. And so consequently gave Imperium a bit of a negative review. But I came around reading the other books in the trilogy. Conspirator and Dictator were dealing with some very interesting periods in Cicero's life, some interesting periods in the Roman Republic, and I thought we're told with an appropriate amount of detail and skill to immerse yourselves in the story. So I came around to that trilogy eventually. Speaking of Robert Harris... he wrote another book, which is, where is it over here? Yes, An Officer and a Spy, which is about the Dreyfus scandal in France. Now, this is going to the modern part of it. This is something that was happening in the 1880s and 1890s in France. And this is something I learned about briefly in one of my modern history courses at college, the Dreyfus Affair, where there was a Jewish officer in the French army who was accused of treason, and he had probably been picked out simply because he was Jewish and had these charges pinned on him. As the trial went on, it emerged that the evidence against him was quite flimsy, and it ended up being this whole big affair that divided French politics for like 10 years. And Robert Harris manages to make a historical novel out of this by following the story of the police officer who was assigned to find the evidence to condemn Dreyfus, but then eventually realizes that he's in the middle of a conspiracy to try and bury an innocent man. And as far as I can tell, it's all based on real history. Now there's a caveat maybe I should have mentioned at the beginning of the video. Caveat that applies to all the books in this series, which is I'm not an expert as far as I know, etc. But yeah, it's just really great storytelling. So as you're following this character and you're getting deeper and deeper into this conspiracy, and you're reading it and you're like, this can't possibly be real. This is too bizarre to be real. But then you go to Wikipedia and you're like, oh, okay, it really went down like that. And it's just a fascinating story. So yeah, that definitely one of my favorites, An Officer and a Spy by Robert Harris. Okay, so jumping around a little bit here, maybe back to the ancient world. A few years ago, I discovered a trilogy on Alexander the Great by Valerio Massimo Manfredi. Alexander, Child of a Dream, Alexander the Sands of Aman, and Alexander the Inns of the Earth, all historical fiction about Alexander the Great. I discovered these randomly by looking around a used bookstore in Cambodia. And just because all three books in the trilogy happened to be in the used bookstore, I thought I'm going to buy these and read them and just do the whole trilogy. They are okay. I was never a big fan of the prose style of Valerio Massimo Manfredi. Or maybe I should say I wasn't a fan of his dialogue. It seemed a little bit over the top and not quite believable. He's an Italian writer who's been translated into English, so one always wonders how much has been lost in the translation. But they are readable. And as you read them, you do find out the story of Alexander the Great. I was fact-checking Wikipedia as I was reading them, and eventually these books got me inspired enough that I picked up an actual biography of Alexander the Great. They're broadly historical. They smudge some of the details, but most of it is true. And you learn a lot of history from it, and it certainly gets you fascinated in these characters. Now, as I was reading these books and doing my research on Wikipedia and stuff like that, I began to notice that whenever anybody would talk about these books, they would always say, well, of course, it's nowhere good as Mary Renault's Alexander the Great trilogy. So apparently there was this trilogy by Mary Renault, which came out in the 70s about Alexander the Great, which is just like everybody's favorite Alexander the Great historical fiction. So I checked those books out. I had to wait till I was back in the U.S. visiting, because I was living in Cambodia at the time. When I was back in the U.S. visiting, I special ordered them through my local bookstore and got them. So they consist of 3 books: Fire from Heaven, The Persian Boy, and Funeral Games. First book is about Alexander the Great's kind of childhood and rise to prominence. Second is about his Persian conquest, and it's told through the eyes of the Persian eunuch. I believe his name was Bagoas. Apologies if I'm forgetting that. A real historical character was a Persian eunuch who became one of Alexander the Great's favorites after he conquered Persia. And then the third one is Funeral Games, and that describes the battling among the generals after Alexander the Great's death. Yes, with apologies to all the people out there who love this trilogy, I struggled with it a bit. And I believe the reason I struggled with it is quite simple. This is literature. So, I'm coming to historical fiction as a simple person who just wants to know what happened and just wants a story, a fun story to immerse myself in, or, as the case may be with some of these events, maybe a not so fun story, but I just want history dramatized. Mary Renault is writing in very flowery, poetic language that is appealing to people who are more appreciative of literature. And I'm a Philistine. So I wouldn't say I got nothing out of them. I struggled through them. I enjoyed parts of them. There were certainly enough interesting period details in them to appeal to someone like me who is interested in the history, but just bear in mind, you're not only getting the history, you're also getting a lot of literature with this. The one I enjoyed the most was the last one, Funeral Games, just because there was so much happening in that one. It's like Game of Thrones, and I know that comparison is a little bit overdrawn these days, but you know, the top guy dies, and then everybody is scrambling out to position themselves, and it's everybody against everybody, and the alliances are changing. It's really packed with a lot of plot, and I found that fascinating. Now, ironically, as it happens, Funeral Games is the one that most people like the least. So I guess my tastes are a little bit out of step with most people, but there you go. Now, speaking of historical fiction, which is also written at a high level of literature, I suppose this is as good a place as any to talk about the Thomas Cromwell trilogy by Hilary Mantel. So this is the trilogy of historical fiction about Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry VIII's famous fix-it man. He was famous for getting things done for King Henry VIII. So a lot of what I said about Mary Renault's trilogy is going to be true here. People who like beautifully written literature are going to really like this book. I am a simple man who likes his prose simple, and so I struggled with that a bit. But I was able to get stuff out of it, definitely. There is a story in there. If you're willing to engage with the more complicated sentences and unpack some of the literary things she's doing there is a thrilling story underneath it. And I did enjoy that story. And Hilary Mantel also has another historical fiction based on the French Revolution called A Place of Greater Safety, which follows the story of three prominent French revolutionaries, Robespierre, Danton, and Camille Desmoulins. Apologies for mispronouncing that. That one I also read, and the French Revolution is one of my pet historical interests. So was predisposed to like it, but I really liked it. It's somewhat high. The prose is operating on a little bit more of a higher level, but it's perhaps because it's one of her earlier works. The prose is a bit less developed than the Thomas Cromwell trilogy. I found it a simpler read on the whole. Tons of interesting detail in there. I checked out some of the things in the book. I checked out on Wikipedia, and they didn't exactly happen exactly the way they were in the book, as apparently it happened in real life. But again, I think those kind of fudging details are rare. On the whole, I think this is, again, one of those historical fictions which is packed full of accurate information. Okay. I've got a couple things left on this list. Not much, but a few. And I'm going to have to make a part 2 here because the camera I'm using has a 30-minute time limit. So I'm going to stop this video now, and then I'll link to part 2 in the description down below. And I will see you in part 2.